Hello, everybody. It's BJ Miller and Ladybird Morgan here in follow-up to today's webinar on trauma and grief. So we're just going to answer the questions that we didn't quite get to in the actual webinar. So with that, over to you, Sonia.
Thank you, BJ. All right, this first one, this person asks, how does trauma intersect with social change and finding new meaning, like the pandemic?
So, wait, say again, how does trauma, sorry, read it one more time, I'm a little sluggish.
How does trauma intersect with social change? Or maybe in this case, how can trauma influence social change? Or is there a relationship between trauma and social change?
Yes.
Yes, I'd offer something of an answer, but let's cut right over to you, Lady Bird.
Well, I mean, absolutely. Trauma informs social change and it can guide us. And it's how we react, and it can also be how we respond. So it's a both. I mean, I'm just going to always say both and, but we're reacting to trauma, and then that pushes us to respond to something. And hopefully our response is more informed by the healing and the processing of what those initial trauma stories were versus just a repeating process of keeping those same cycles going and going and going. So right now with COVID, there's a lot of reaction that's happening, but there's also some efforts being made at responding. And if we can do more of the responding, the reactions will not take over the movement of where we're going into the future. That makes sense.
I think I got you. I mean, I think it's yes. So let's see if our answers are the same. My answer would be something like, yes, extremely important to understanding how we got to the place we are. Is understanding trauma would go a long way to helping us understand how we got to the place we are. And also understanding trauma would help inform ways to process these events and to move us out of a reactive nervous system, like you're saying, Lady Bird, into a more thoughtful response, more measured, more thoughtful, more all-encompassing, so we don't accidentally keep just punting the pain down the road a little bit further. So is that much the same? Do we say the same thing?
I think so, and that, collectively, like from a governmental standpoint of like what's happening with trauma to COVID and how people are responding to COVID, understanding that it's basically out of survival. So everyone's choices are being made based on their perceived notion of how they're going to survive this experience. And not everybody has the same notion of that because of their own experience and where they hold trauma is in their body and how they feel safe in the world. So yes, it's all totally related, and hopefully more awareness about it. Like BJ, you were saying, more awareness about trauma, where it's from and why we have it and what we're doing with it will help inform our responses.
Sorry, I was just reminded of a case in point. Like I'll happily own the fact that I'm very pro-vaccination. I'm a physician and I understand to some degree the medical science behind the vaccines. I understand how vaccines work, medical research, etc. So I am out of the closet very pro-vaccine. And I must say, anti-vaccine folks, people who are against the vaccine, on some level give me a great deal of consternation, and one might see that as selfish, or there's all sorts of way that gets read and presented to us through the media elsewhere, where it just drives this division. And I can't remember where I was recently where I saw someone who pointed out something akin to what you just said, Lady Bird, which is like, if we really step back and looked at the folks who are, many of whom are opting out of the vaccine or not taking the vaccine, very likely because they're afraid of something. There's something feeling unsafe to them about that. And so I get kind of, what's wrong with these people? And the truth is, well, maybe there's some safety issue that needs to be addressed. Maybe there was some historic response to another vaccine, or they've had some really bad run-ins with the medical system, which I absolutely appreciate, et cetera. So it's just another sort of a good case in point right now to understand as we feel these divisions among us. Perhaps start with the supposition that there's been some trauma or some absence of safety from which this person is acting, and that's the place that needs our attention, not more information on a vaccine per se or trying to ram it into someone's arm. Does that make So okay. Well, how about the next question?
Yeah, this person said, I really appreciate Ladybird's comments about trauma living in the body. Can you say more about methods for finding safety in your body and releasing trauma from the body, especially when there may not even be a narrative?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great when there's not a narrative because then you don't get distracted by that. So in some ways, that's a benefit to not have a narrative. Just finding a safe place in the world is a good start. It doesn't have to be another person. You know, nature is very nourishing. We can start to communicate with ourselves out in the woods or in the ocean. It doesn't have to be a conversation or where you're actually articulating something to somebody else. Having an embodied experience is really what's important, and you paying attention to that and getting more familiar with it. So it's really just developing a relationship with your felt sense, and letting it inform you and getting curious about it and articulating whatever in whatever ways you want, through your voice, through paper, through movement. It doesn't have to be a set way. So finding that first in yourself, and then as you feel safe and comfortable and interested, reaching out to actual facilitators or people that work with different ways of communicating with what's coming through your body. And there's so many different ways of doing that. But again, if you can at least start with your own body and trusting your own voice around that, it might help guide you to where you want to go and explore that. And I'm certainly available to have conversations about that, you know, in depth, if that would be helpful, to help kind of climb up a path.
Yeah, amen. And there are, sort of psychotherapeutic modalities like somatic experience. There's an increasing appreciation of that psychiatry and psychology have really focused on the thinking self, not so much the feeling self for a long time. And there's some effort to make that field whole again and bring the body back into it. So increasingly there'll be psychotherapeutic experiences that will touch on the body as a way to work with the body. That's true. More informally, you know, also finding where you feel good in your body, even if it's like one elbow, sometimes can be very useful as a place to build on and work from and pull your attention to. And also dealing with pain, which could say pain a trauma, probably an important distinction to be made there, but difficult feelings in the body at some point, once you're feeling safe, once that's established, oftentimes it pays to go into those hard feelings and work with them. But I wouldn't do that before you feel safe. And if it's really complicated, I wouldn't do that by yourself. If you can have some sort of guidance with a therapist or someone who understands the body, or if you're lucky enough to talk to Ladybird. But at some point, there can be real utility into going into those hard feelings, going into the hard place of the body. But be careful, because that can be a way to re-traumatize yourself if you're not doing it in a safe place or with guidance.
Great. Okay, this next one has a little bit of a story, so I'll read it out and then get to the question. So this person said, I am a bereaved mother with a large trauma body. In this present moment, I am grateful to feel safe in my body, and I feel resourced enough to deepen these feelings of safety. However, something that comes up for me frequently is the felt sense that I'm not doing enough for my surviving son. I'm curious about your perspective around mothering a child with a large trauma body and supporting his path forward with the goal that he feel a deepening security in the present moment.
Well, maybe I'll kick us off. I mean, there's a potential here. I mean, your own awareness is going to be so key, and finding a way to graduate from the reactive, mindless kind of nervous system reactivity that comes with trauma, and move that into a more measured response place, whether that's through meditation or time or grieving rituals, but building in a little distance between the impulse and the reaction to it. That can help you put this body of trauma in proportion to the rest of your life. And can also help assure that however you're treating your son isn't simply coming from that reactive trauma place. So your own work around awareness and tending to your body and tending to your own life, I would say, seems to be really so much of your homework there on behalf of your other son. And the last point I would make would be that there's this potential here for this to be incredibly enriching experiences for your son. He very well might learn a ton from you in this way. I think a lot of people who suffer, I know a lot of people who suffer from a childhood that really nothing went wrong, where a parent seemed to have no pain, no problems, and then when that child gets into adulthood and has their first difficult experience, they can feel unequipped. So not to be Pollyannish, but what you're describing is that large body trauma in you. There's a potential there for that be deeply enriching and expansive for the life of your son. That much the potential I can hold it.
It's beautiful. Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is well, maybe just adding on to that notion of really tending to yourself and to your body and what's happening for you, and that actually is the model. Your son is learning through you, and he's watching, he's also feeling, because you are viscerally connected. And as a mother, that place of acknowledging that, oh, I'm always going to be concerned about this being on the planet as long as I am alive. So just sort of reconciling that attachment is there, that attachment is healthy and good. And you can just know that you might not agree with how he is having, what's happening for him around his own trauma, but you're still holding him in that place of love and compassion, and broadening that boat, and just keep continuing to get it broader and broader and broader, so that the place that he comes to rest is so held and safe, that he can find his way in that. So
yeah, there's a real shared bond in the making here. Yeah.
Okay, this last one is a little bit of a clarification around the concept of grief. So they're asking to clarify grief as a cause of deep sadness versus what is being experienced as a deep sadness, like uncontrolled crying. So maybe just talking about grief as a cause and then how it manifests in the body, I think is what this person was getting to. And apologies because that person is not on this phone call to clarify, but that's what I'm reading it as, is kind of how it shows up for us in our physical body.
Well, I mean, I have a comment that I can just start. I think that it shows up differently for everyone, and the key and how that's being the questions being articulated is, when is it untenable? Like, when is that grief too much? When is the expression of grief something that can't be worked with and dealt with? Not dealt with, I hate to use that word, but uncontrollable crying that happens and then passes through, and then you find your way to being able to step back into your life, is one thing. Uncontrollable crying that doesn't allow you to get out of bed, and you're no longer eating and drinking, and you're not able to communicate, and you can't understand why you have a reason to live. That's different than just grief. That's now a processing that's happening, that's moving into a deeper place of process. But grief in and of itself is just an expression. And some people can have grief and never shed a tear, or become really active in the work that they're doing, or really transform it in ways that are shocking to other people. So it's really it's about what's working for you in terms of how you can show up in your own life. And if that's not happening, that's when getting some support is important. Long answer.
Yeah, I'm with Ladybird on that. Do you think we heard the question right though, Sonia?
Well, I mean, again, apologies to the person who asked. I'm not sure that I, got it, but it was just kind of a clarifying of a cause of deep sadness and then what is experienced as a deep emotion.
Do you want to read the question one more time?
Yeah, sure. So this person said, please clarify. Grief as a cause of deep sadness seems that it distances grief from what I have experienced as the deep feelings, expressions of sadness, including for me, an uncontrolled crying.
that grief separates her from the sadness. Yeah, I feel like I'm missing a beat here because if I'm here, grief and grieving process, like Ladybird's saying, it's an expression. It's a way these emotions play out. But it's hard for me to imagine a grieving process that would separate you from your sorrow or separate your sorrow from the rest of your life. I think of grief as a way, as sort of a metabolic way to help you integrate these forces, including these uncontrollable crying and everything else. That uncontrollable crying, as an example, is not some anomalous event in your life, some detour, but that is part of that's welcomed in as part of grief, and that should be a force over time to bring you closer to your feelings and bring your feelings more relevant to the rest of your life. So I wonder if we're missing a beat there.
I'm also wondering if it's about like the actual word of grief, like the defining of grief and feeling separated from the definition and what is being felt. But
yeah, like grief versus grieving. What does it mean to be grieving, the act of grieving, versus just what does grief mean? And like I can wake up in the morning and think of my grandmother and miss her dearly, and that's a moment of grief. But I'm not going into uncontrollable crying or deciding to have a ritual right then or needing to call a friend. But it's living in me. So grief, you can think of grief as a living part of how you experience the world. It's not necessarily an endpoint or something you do and then you're done. I'm done with grieving. Okay, now moving on. It expresses in different ways at different times based on your resourcing, your just ability to have expression and what you feel comfortable doing. And if crying and that uncontrollable crying allows you, like DJ said, to reconnect, I think we talked about that in the presentation, that grieving is a way of connecting a hurt experience back out into the world so that you do feel connected again. So whatever that looks like.
It may be that by virtue of us owning our grief and letting ourselves having crying, letting those crying fits come, perhaps, it is true too that we live in a world that doesn't necessarily appreciate or understand grief, and it may feel like if you burst into tears in the middle of a social situation, that may feel like a distancing or an alienating moment. In case that's at the heart of your question, that's really on the audience there. If we lived in a society that was more honest before its grief, uncontrollable crying would make perfect sense most days at some point and would be just part of the fabric of life. So we think you're doing what you're describing sounds very normal to us. If it's chafing those around you or seeming to alienate you from those around you, that's on them. That sucks. You're the one feeling it, and it's probably doesn't help to hear me say, well, that's on them, screw them. But it is kind of on them. So I don't know if that helps at all, but if we've totally missed your question,
let us know. I know I'm really curious. I know we want to know if we missed your question completely.
Yeah.
Please ask it again.
Come on back.
Yeah, no problem. I can reach out to the person who asked and we can clarify. Okay, well, that was all of our questions. Thank you guys so much for answering. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, you're welcome.
Au revoir. Ladybird, you're the best, sweetheart. Thank you.
Thanks for this